So, welcome to the Ex-Religious Support Network. Our aim is to provide a safe space for people who have left or are thinking of leaving their religion. To find us on Meetup, simply search for Ex-Religious Support Network. On Facebook, search for Ex-Religious Discussion Group. My name is Allan and I'm the group facilitator. This is the third session in a series of Q&A sessions in which we explore what it's like to think and walk in someone else's shoes. You've given up on your mission of pleasing the divine being and saving others. So what do you believe now? How do you live? And what do you care about? Out there is a smorgasbord of worldviews and stances to choose from. Our special guest today is Karyn Robinson. Karyn describes herself as a pantheist. A little about Karyn. She is a New Zealander who studied at the University of Waikato.
Waikato.
Thank you very much, Karyn. And at the University of New South Wales. Karyn has a degree in teaching, a master's in environmental management, and a graduate certificate in developmental trauma. She now lives in Wollongong, New South Wales. Karyn is a senior advisor with the Australian Childhood Foundation, providing consultation and training in developmental trauma due to neglect, abuse, and domestic violence. She has been a self-confessed tree hugger and greenie all her life. Please welcome Karyn.
Thank you.
So to get started, Karyn, let me ask you three initial questions. The first one is, can you say briefly what pantheism is? And I believe you call yourself a scientific pantheist.
So you could probably sum it up in the short phrase, nature is my God. And really depending on who you speak to, you're going to have slightly different viewpoints. So as a scientific pantheist, I'm obviously more rooted in the idea of the understanding around science and what we understand through science, whereas some pantheists might feel a spiritual sense in nature and in living beings. Not so much a God, but just a sort of a sense of spirituality in those living beings. So for me, pantheism really is, we define it as a deep reverence for the universe and for nature, and that humans are just part of that we're all connected, and there is nothing more worthy of that deep reverence than nature and the universe that we live in.
Great, thanks, Karyn. And I'm wondering, how did you hear about pantheism? How did you get involved in the movement?
It was funny. My parents actually sort of said to me, a number of years ago, I think you're a bit of a pantheist. And I think I was sort of in my late 20s, and I was just like, yeah, whatever, because I was busy doing what 20-year-olds do, is travel and socialize, and not really sort of thinking much about the deeper meaning of life. But somewhere along the line, when I got through that phase, and I kept chatting to my dad, and I visited home one time, and he had this book, which is the Bible of pantheists, really, and had a bit of a read, because he said you might find this interesting. And sure enough, when I read it, I was just like, yeah, that sort of sums me up nicely. So it was really through my dad that I came to realize that I was a pantheist.
How did you get involved in the movement?
Yeah, so it's really through my dad, and my parents would always bring people together for events like the changing of the seasons, and very old pagan traditions, really, but interestingly enough, and we can explore this later through questions, but because pantheism is a lot about revering nature, we obviously also are aware of the changing of the seasons and traditionally what that would mean for people. And so they would bring people together for traditional solstice gatherings and things like that. So that was really watching them, and just the really lovely way that they brought people together to celebrate nature and to celebrate life and each other. And that was sort of how I saw my involvement kind of blossom.
Reading that book, it really gelled with you. Can I please ask you to hold that book up again, because some of us have missed it. It's called Pantheism, Elements of Pantheism. And who is it by?
So Paul Harrison, and he runs the Pantheist Facebook page.
Right, the Australian one.
He's helped set that up.
Right.
And I'm one of the moderators. So he's American, and really sort of pulled together this as a reference point, because interestingly enough, although pantheism and the idea of pantheism has been around for a very long time and only got the name pantheism in 1705, it's never really sort of been brought together in a book, in a document. So that's sort of the go-to, really, if you want to know more.
Oh, okay. So with the book, what was it that you saw in the book? What was it that attracted you to the pantheist way of life?
It was just interesting because, and I've noted that this is what happens a lot of the time, because I suspect that people are pantheists. I meet a lot of people and I think, oh, I think you might be pantheist. But you know, some people don't like labels. They don't need a label to put on their beliefs. And I guess I was probably like that too. I was quite clear about how I felt, but I didn't feel a great need to find a label for it. But when Dad suggested I have a bit of a flick through it, and as I was reading, I was just like, yep, that's me. Yep, that's me. Yes, that's me. And so I was like, okay, well, there you go. Like, it's apparently I'm a pantheist, because everything that the view that I have of the world and how I feel about nature, and it's all summed up under the one umbrella of pantheism. So it just sort of, it brought a name to what I already knew that I felt and believed, and the way I saw things.
Oh, great. Well, that's really a great introduction. So I'll open it up to the floor, open it up to our participants now to ask Karyn any question. If you'd like to unmute Bernie.
I'm wondering, I did a master's thesis on American pantheism. And in my analysis of American pantheism, I also self-identify as a pantheist myself. I divided pantheism into the scientific pantheists, some people would call it naturalistic pantheists, and the spiritualized pantheists. That, you know, some of them will embrace the term pantheist, but I'm also a religion scholar, and so I would look at those folks and say that they are pretty new age in their orientation. You know, it is not a strictly naturalistic scientific orientation. And on Facebook, there is this huge, it has like 20,000 members, I think, pantheism group out of Venice Beach, California, one of the founders. And in terms of just getting a huge array of folks that travel under this banner of pantheism. Actually, I find the scientific pantheists kind of a minority in that group. And I'm wondering, down in Australia and Australian pantheists, do you have much contact with what I'll call the new age flavor of pantheism? Or do you manage to confine yourself just to the scientific pantheists?
Yeah, there's not a lot of, because the Facebook group I belong to is the scientific pantheists. And so we're all pretty much grounded in that sort of side of things. And really in Australia, it's not hugely well known. And so there's not actually a great deal of people, even if I did stumble across somebody that was of the more spiritual side of pantheism. So that I mean, I literally am the only self-declared pantheist on the Scientific Pantheist Facebook group for Australia. So I'm rattling around here by myself. And I say that sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek because, as I said, I think that there are a lot of people that a lot of people are on the same wavelength and would probably actually tick off all the things that pantheists see and feel and perceive, but don't necessarily call themselves pantheists. So no, we're not tripping over, a lot of the more spiritual pantheists. I'm not tripping over any pantheists, quite frankly, around here.
You talked about people that don't necessarily take on the label, but I've encountered over the 40 years that I have called myself a pantheist. I'll describe it, and they'll go, "Oh my goodness, I'm a pantheist."
That's exactly what they do. Yeah.
I had no idea there was a word for what I was. So, there's those who, just have this aversion to labels. But then there's also those that say, good, I now know what to call myself.
It's been absolutely. I've found that too, is that I'm a bit tentative when I'm talking to somebody, and then I might sort of say, it sounds in line with pantheism, because some people sort of feel like you might be trying to bring them over to the dark side into a cult or something, because I think that some people feel that we dance around trees and right. There's shades of that. But it's interesting because some people sort of will say, "Oh, I didn't realize that there was a name for it," and they're sort of quite happy. And others will go, "God, I had no idea that I was a pantheist," and others will go, they'll just sort of wriggle and not be so comfortable with that, and that's okay as well. It's just nice to know that people are out there that are closet pantheists, and they don't have to have the name.
Oh, thanks, Bernie. Thanks, Karyn. Now, Nathan asked a question in the chat. Which pantheism Facebook group are you in, Karyn? He says, I can see quite a few in the search results. Now, I've put in the link to the Australian Scientific Pantheist, but you might like to say something about that, Karyn.
The funny thing about being a pantheist is that we're a bit of a disparate, like we're very individuals. And so it's not really a high activity website, because you'll find with pantheists is that it's the way that we live, which means that we just have our own ways of being in nature, respecting nature, trying to live lightly on the earth. And so we just go about our business doing that. And we don't necessarily do a lot of conversing and chatting across the likes of Zoom and so forth, which is a little bit sad, actually. So it doesn't have a great deal of traffic, but every now and then someone will, pop something on there that relates to something about, a lot of the time it'll be to do with some sort of conservation efforts or something really sort of amazing about nature. So some amazing fact with a nature aspect to it. So those are the things that get posted on there. But we are pretty scattered. And like I say, I'm the only one self-confessed pantheist in Wollongong. There's a little hub sort of around Queensland. There's perhaps a few down in Melbourne that are on the website, but we're sort of sprinkled around fairly sparsely.
Oh, thanks for that question, Nathan. Thanks, Karyn. Paul, you have a question.
Yes, I think you may have started to answer the question I had in mind, because I was going to ask you about how one actually practices pantheism and ism rather. And in your introduction, you described, if you like, your belief rather than what you actually how one actually practices it. And so maybe you can expand on that a little more.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. And I think it's interesting. I'm trying to do justice to being here because it's an absolute honor, but it really depends on who you talk to, because we're all so different in what we do. There are no strict ceremonies, there's no strict traditions, there's no particular days, there's nothing to prescribe to us how we should be practicing pantheism. So what you'll find is there's a general underlying current of, as I said, we may practice it in the products that we choose and in the way we live. So we might work very hard to tend to our garden so that, there's probably a lot of pantheists that are permaculture people. There's probably a lot of pantheists that are environmentalists, and so we do everything we can to live lightly. As far as celebrations, again, it's an interesting one, the traditions and celebrations and how we practice it, because for some of us, we will go into the ocean or we'll go into the bush and just walk and be at one with it and sit on a rock and overlook a vast plain and just be in awe of that. Others, like I said, with my parents, they will gather people and actually have a number of like the solstice. And so they do little traditional things, like you might tie, and they're embedded in old pagan ways, but tie a ribbon on a tree to acknowledge a loved one that's passed. And there's speeches that you may make, and just little traditions like that you may do. So you can do that as well. But most of us, we find our own ways. We become involved in groups that are fighting for environmental protection. We are often involved in fighting for human rights and human justice, because it aligns with so it's actually depends on which pantheist, who you talk to, as to how they practice and how they find a way of living in the pantheist way. But it will have that common thread of living lightly on the earth, revering in some way nature, however you do that. So for me, I go at dawn or just before dawn, I go to the beach and I walk on the beach and I wait for the sun to rise over the rocks. And that is how I connect. One way I connect as a pantheist and revere the beauty. So it really depends on who you are, where you live, what kind of lifestyle you lead, as to how you will practice your pantheist ways, your philosophy, your religion.
So maybe it might be worth thinking then about what you're not or what you don't do, rather than
absolutely. And that's
I was thinking then, for example, the relationship you would have, if you like, with the conventional idea of God. Does that sort of help to give you a point of reference?
It's just really interesting, because in actually the book, Paul mentions that sometimes it's easier to explain to people what we're not. And so you could probably ask a number of questions about, and I would say, no, we don't, or we don't do that, or we don't think that. So as far as a all-powerful God, one that may judge us, or we're not guided by a Bible. We're not guided by any sort of doctrine or, 10 Commandments, anything like that. What you will find with pantheists is that they are largely driven by a very deep-seated belief that we have to look after nature, because it's so important and we revere it so much. And the thing is that if we don't look after it, we are in effect killing ourselves and everything with us, because we're all interconnected. So
it's values driven, based on those.
Values driven, absolutely. But I think one of the things is that the experience of awe and the experience of wonder and a very sort of deep respect for moments in nature. So what you'll find with pantheists is they may see a bee collecting its pollen, and in that moment, that deep reverence and awe of how nature works and the intricacies. You might look up at the stars and, happen to see a comet or whatever, and just be in awe, and the humbleness that you feel. So I think there's a deep feeling that pantheists have when they connect or they note the world around them, that natural world around them that drives that. So it is values, but it also is very much a feeling, a deep sort of feeling that comes from what we see in nature.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Karyn. And before we go to John, that raises in me the thought that pantheists are quite different to someone who values the environment for purely instrumental reasons. Like they say, we've got to look after the environment because A, if we don't do anything about global warming and buggering up the atmosphere, then we're all going to die. And B, if we don't conserve resources, stop cutting down trees, destroying natural habitats, we're going to pollute ourselves to death and run out of resources. So someone who values looking after the environment for purely those self-interested reasons is quite different to a pantheist, I take it, who values nature, sees value in nature for itself, not just because of its value to human beings.
I think that's a good pickup, Les, because absolutely we support, the reasons that you've just pointed out, but the driving force is actually that humans are only one species. We don't put ourselves above any other living species, and that nature has its own intrinsic worth, that it is beyond, and we wouldn't exist without it. We're only a very small part of it. So I guess driven to take care of it where we can, not because of what it can give us and provide us, but because it requires our deep respect of its own.
Oh, great. John, you have a question.
Yes, my question is, I'm just wondering how the following 3 points that I want to bring up relate to your pantheism. The first is, I'm a member of Sophia, which is the Don Cupid group, Sea of Faith, although there's not a lot of faith in it, but they stress panentheism, and they then move on to seeing that in naturalistic terms as part of nature, and it's incorporating everything within nature. That's the first aspect. The second is I'm very interested in the history of religions in USA, and it's very easy to see that, from the American Revolution, 1776, the god there was the god, the capital G God in a circle or a triangle, but that was very much the deist god. And that is in itself was a sort of a pantheism of equating the deity with the functioning of the natural universe. But earlier, you had the other tradition of God, which was the Pilgrim Fathers who came in 1620. And there they had the fully blown Christian triune God, the supernatural being, the prayers, a theistic God. And then, of course, that has led to today's literalistic biblical fundamentalism, which authorises their claims to infallibility. So you've got these three streams of God talk, and I'm just, as I said, I'm just wondering how you see them relating to your pantheism.
Only in as much as the man that first gave pantheist its name, not that he created pantheism, but he actually just gave it the name in 1700. In that tradition, yes, he used the word God a lot in respect to nature. And even prior to that, there was a lot of talk around God. There has been a shift from those times, and also in respect to the fact that when you go back far enough, it was actually very risky to hold views that there was no actual supreme being, and that the universe itself was on par with a personified God. So when people were actually able to express those views more and move further away from an all-powerful, all-seeing God, the word God has diminished, I guess, in how pantheists may use the word God. And in fact, I know I probably steer clear of using the word God, although if you look at if you were to look up pantheism in some of the dictionaries, God is mentioned. So all nature is God, God is nature. But I think really when it boils down to it, pantheists do not believe in a supreme being. We don't believe in an all-seeing, all-powerful God. So when we say God, what we're referring to is the universe as deep reverence and the highest being, if you like. But it's not a sentient being. It's not all powerful, all seeing, and it doesn't give a stuff about humans. It just exists because of the way that the nature of atoms and so forth. So I guess pantheism in its modern terms is not really referring to it. It doesn't generally use the word God much because of that, I guess, tendency for people when you hear God to have that very narrow view of what we might mean by that. And pantheists don't. It's not part of how we view the world. But
yeah, I'm just wondering about context of the motto that the USA introduced in the 1950s, apparently, "In God We Trust." Now, obviously, the people that have personified God and praying to him every night, they'll say that's the God that's meant. And of course, I think it came out of the deistic tradition, actually, as more pantheistic. So I'm just wondering if you've got any comment on how pantheists would deal with that. It's a very commonly used phrase now in America, "In God We Trust." It sounds all very pious, but it's very confusing.
Well, I think I'm lucky because I don't live in America, and so there's not a lot. In Australia and New Zealand, much more secular, and so I don't have to sort of feel terribly challenged. But when push comes to shove, and I'm in a position where I'm asked to pray, or I'm in a position where I just replace God with nature in my head, universe, Gaia, whatever you want to call it, and that's how I understand it. So I don't feel too conflicted, if you like, because that is who I revere is the universe on the same level, I guess, as somebody that believes in a all-powerful being.
Thank you, John. Janet's got a question in chat. She asks, Karyn, would you say that Indigenous peoples are pantheists?
I would never give anyone the label, and I don't think they'd thank me for it either. But what I would say is, and this is the beauty of pantheism actually, is that you can be a pantheist in many other things. It doesn't necessarily preclude, but I would say that not really. It depends on which Indigenous population you're talking about, but certainly the different nations around Australia, they have their own view of, I guess, gods, spirits that are held within animals and so forth. So there are definitely views that align with pantheism, and there is a lot of synergy, but they wouldn't be necessarily considered pantheists because they may still hold that there's a spiritual element, or there is a higher being element that's not the universe, but a higher being element. So I couldn't talk on behalf of any Indigenous community, but I would say that there is definite synergy because they have a reverence for nature. Doesn't necessarily, the way that they revere it isn't necessarily the same as a pantheist, but there is definite reverence, and there is definite synergy around how it guides them and how they live their lives and how they walk on the earth and their connection to earth. So there are definite parallels, but probably not, it's not interchangeable, or yeah.
Karyn, if I can ask a question, I'm wondering whether you make a distinction between the moral value of non-sentient parts of the environment, rivers, beautiful mountains, and sentient creatures that have the capacity to feel pain and suffering. So, for example, I'm trying to think of a practical example where you have to choose one or the other, and I can't think of any that it's a really good example. Theoretically, how would you weigh the value of, say, a beautiful mountain compared with a bunch of squirrels? And we know squirrels are sentient. Is there a moral gradation?
Is there a moral gradation? So it's really, I love this because you're really pushing me to think about these things. I suspect in a pantheist view, it would probably be guided by what does the least amount of harm, or what upholds the ecology of an area the most. So if something had to be damaged, what could Mother Nature, what could nature withstand? And what would give serious damage, and the implications that would ripple out from that, because it's really about trying to protect as much of nature as possible, and keep the balance, the ecosystem healthy. So probably the least amount of damage.
Just to tease that out a bit more, in contemporary moral philosophy, there's a new breed of moral philosophers who think that parts of the environment, and I'm thinking specifically of mountains and rivers, have intrinsic moral value, whereas one of the dominant moral traditions before that, utilitarianism, only saw intrinsic value in creatures that had sentience, who had the capacity to feel pain and suffering. So this is really being battled out in fought over in contemporary moral philosophy. Do mountains and rivers have intrinsic value in themselves, independently of their impacts on sentient creatures like the squirrels who appreciate them, and human beings who appreciate mountains and rivers?
I think, if I'm giving an answer, it's really probably from me and not from a pantheist point of view. Do you know what I mean? Because we're getting into a space where there would be differences amongst pantheists probably as to how we would answer, and it would probably take a little bit of discussion as well. If you chucked a whole heap of pantheists together and asked them that question, what we would come out with. And it's a tricky one, because I think that most pantheists would ultimately say that everything has intrinsic value, whether they're sentient or not, because it's all part of the universe, and it's been created by the forces of physics and nature, and all of those things. And so everything has a right to be as it is. But beyond that, I'd be speaking as Karyn, not as a pantheist. I have a feeling.
No, thanks, Karyn. Dirk, you have a question.
Thank you for your presentation, Karyn. But among the sentient beings, we spoke earlier about squirrels, which don't belong in Australia. What distinction can be made amongst the native animals and the introduced ferals? I'm thinking, for instance, of the destruction that's happening to a lot of the native animals in the Kosciuszko High Country by the feral horses. I'm thinking of the damage that's recently been highlighted by the deer in the Tasmanian wilderness areas, which are some of the most highly respected places from an ecological point of view, and they meet 5 out of the criteria for World Heritage listing, which is one of the highest. So that's an interesting one to look at.
Yeah, I think it goes like, I mean, that's human playing God in a way, isn't it? The way that we've introduced things that weren't supposed to be where they are, and now they're causing problems. And I think as a pantheist, you'd probably be looking at, if we're stuffing things up by introducing things like cane toads or deers, or in New Zealand, it's actually possums and stoats and things like that. And again, this is probably tipping over into Karyn's view, not necessarily all pantheist views, because we don't have a very tightly guided way of viewing things, but to protect the natural balance of an ecosystem, and we've gone and introduced a creature, animal that is actually damaging that ecosystem, then we would be trying to, as much as possible, remove those animals from that ecosystem. And we would be trying to do it as environmentally friendly and with as least pain to those animals as possible. I mean, that doesn't sit nicely, but it's a human-made problem. And if it's creating issues in the balance of an ecosystem, and we recognize that ecosystems are, again, part of this awe-inspiring existence, and they are self-perpetuating, except for when we come whopping in and decide that we need to introduce rabbits or whatever, that we need to probably look after the health of the ecosystem and remove whatever has been introduced because of humans in the most painless way as possible.
Thank you. I agree with you.
Karyn, it sounds like the pantheist movement is not really big on ritual and even celebration. I'm interested in what you do for the solstice. Can you talk a little bit more about your ceremony around the solstice and what you do there?
Yeah, you've caught me on the hop there, because my parents are the ones that organise that,
Yeah.
and they're in New Zealand, so I've missed a lot, and I've only sort of been able to be there on occasion, and so my knowledge of it is actually pretty sketchy, and they've consulted guidance around what we know are old, I'd say pagan traditions, but that's possibly misleading as well, because they're really sort of traditions that recognize the change of seasons, but also important sort of aspects of living. And so, for instance, Halloween falls on the same, it falls around one of the solstice changes, the season changes. It's Samhain, which is actually, it's been taken over as Halloween, but it's the Day of the Dead. It's when we recognize those that have gone before us, and people that were important to us. And so, again, that's an opportunity that pantheists, not all of us, but it's one of those times where we would happily celebrate and incorporate tradition that might actually come from even places like Mexico, where they have the Day of the Dead, or Celtic traditions where they also had their Day of the Dead to honor those that have passed before us. And really, because it's so open, you can take what you like and you can create your own ways of honoring. It's really very open. Now, I think for some people that's way too open, and they wouldn't find that helpful and they wouldn't find that useful. For others who don't like to be told what to do and how to do it, it's nice, because you can create it how you want it, and you can decide, well, this is important, or this is something that I want to celebrate more, such as the change of the seasons, or when you're in the middle of winter and recognizing what that means and what's going on our side of the earth, and really symbolically, what does that mean? Is it a time to stop and reflect and to honor those that have passed? Is it a time to look forward? So we can look at things like that. We can make a decision about how we want to celebrate, and like I say, we can pick up from traditions that have gone before us that are related to nature and related to life and symbolic in that way, and we weave it in however we wish to weave it in. So it is pretty open, and I can't be more specific than that. There are traditions like you can bring something with you that you no longer use, and everyone brings something and passes it on. So everyone takes away something that and there's nice little traditions like that you can incorporate, which I know that my parents did on those solstice occasions.
I imagine that most pantheists are on the left side of the political spectrum, especially towards the Greens type parties. Are many of them politically active?
Yeah, I think you will find, and again, because there's only a small bunch of people that actually know that pantheists exist and then are, align themselves with that. Whereas there's probably a whole lot of people running around that have pantheist views or are pantheists but don't sit under that label. And you will find a lot of them, and obviously in the Greens movement. And it goes back to some of the points we've been speaking about the fact that nature has its own intrinsic value. It's not there for us to make money out of, and it's not there. We don't necessarily put humans above all other living beings. So we're not privileged in that respect. So what we do, we need to consider what impact it has on every other living being as well. And you're not really going to find that approach probably in liberal policies, because that's not what underpins their policies. So you are going to find that pantheists are more of the left, because it's more about very, very sort of grounded in equality, fairness, and taking care of one another. It's about community, and it's including other living beings in that, and trying to live in a very, it's a very balanced way, so that you're living in harmony with the environment. So it's that way of living. So pantheists, again, it's lovely to have traditions. I wish we had more celebrations. We can do that, but it's actually really the way that you live on a day-to-day basis. And you will find us left of centre.
Okay, I know zoos have become much more humane in the last, couple of decades, more natural environments for their caged animals. So given that they have improved probably quite dramatically, a lot of the zoos around the world, what's your view on zoos? Should they be, in principle, phased out altogether, or is there still a place for zoos, you think, Karyn?
Yeah, there actually is, given the impact of humans on the environment, because zoos frequently run breeding programs, and they try to support genetic continuation of certain lines, which if they weren't there would possibly not exist. And the other thing is that it can bring the wonder of nature to people that may not see it otherwise. And when you take a child or someone that's just not used to going to zoos, or again, it can create awe and wonder in these creatures that you are seeing, and the magnificence and the truly just amazing array of of life. Yeah. So zoos have a place, but thank goodness for a large part they're becoming far more, what should we say, more humane in the way that they do that. But it's still a tricky one, because lions, a lot of creatures have huge areas in which they would normally roam, and it's very hard to emulate that. So the way that we do it is just as important as really whether they existed. Like, if you're going to have zoos, then make sure that they serve the purpose of creating more respect for humans and our fellow creatures, and also for trying to save those that we are, decimating, and trying to raise awareness. So I unfortunately, yes, I think there is a place, and there's always going to be, while humans are living beyond our means.
No, thanks, Karyn. Yes, Robert.
I'm a pantheist, but I wouldn't call myself one. I've been an active conservationist for probably a quarter of a century now, been a vegetarian for half a century, and caring for the natural world and ecosystems and so forth is really, really important to me. But one of the fundamental problems and dilemmas that I'm very, very conscious of is the problem of harmlessness towards other creatures, but at the same time, intense harm towards creatures that do damage, like the cane-toed rabbit sort of issue. It's a huge conflict between the vegetarian in me and the conservationist in me. And the conclusion I've come to is the conservationist wins. And if that involves killing horses in the high country, that involves killing cane toads and involves killing rabbits en masse, then so be it, because they do such immense amounts of damage. So even though I feel enormous amounts of sympathy for my fellow creatures, I feel zero sympathy for some of them because they're just very, very damaging. And the other issue, of course, is the dichotomy between the herbivores and the carnivores. And carnivores kill herbivores, and I just don't see a problem in that, except I don't want to be one. Absolutely, yeah.
It's an interesting, because I think you'll find a high percent, like not all pantheists are vegetarian, and in actual fact, you'd think that we would all be vegans, really, when it comes down to it. But and it is actually even Paul addresses it in his book about that. And yeah, that's part of the reason why I'm vegetarian and why I've been vegetarian for quite some time, and with vegan leanings, because of that idea of trying to reduce the suffering of other living beings. But again, if those other living beings are decimating a natural habitat in which they were never supposed to be, then I have to go with, we need to remove them as painlessly as possible. So, and I think that most pantheists would probably sit with that view as well, because ultimately it's about the greater good of the environment. And if an animal is there only because of us, then we probably need to rectify that problem and stop doing it. Like, we keep repeating these problems. But yeah, so I would agree with that. That's probably where a lot of pantheists would sit.
Yeah, the other really fundamental issue, which concerns me a very great deal, is that we cause immense harm just by being alive. Yes. I have to eat, and the stuff I eat, because being a vegetarian, is all plant matter, and it's grown on farms where the plants are constantly under threat from predatory animals that want to eat them, especially insects, and they have to be destroyed so that I can eat. So even though I try to be a cause of harmlessness, I can't be. It's just impossible.
I think part of, I guess, the pantheist view would be, to a degree, is that there is a cycle of life. There are omnivores, carnivores, and herbivores, and that in itself is just part of the normal natural world. The way that we do it, though, that is departing from the natural world. So when we go into factory farming, and when we are using pesticides and monocrops and things like that, that's when I think you'll find that pantheists diverge, and they won't go there, because that's where it becomes disrupting and disrespectful to the earth. So if you're looking at eating animals, you do it in a respectful way that minimizes suffering, that doesn't harm the land. And so you're trying to do it in a way that is not going to disrespect or to disrupt the natural environment. So there will be pantheists that sit there, and then there'll be pantheists that come all the way over to veganism, but they'll sit somewhere in that view of, you do the most minimal amount of harm and suffering as possible.
Yep, I'm totally on your side there. Though I do think the underlying problem is the enormous population explosion of humans in the last couple of centuries. And that itself is immensely harmful.
Yeah.
So the only real solution is to get rid of most of us. And that's a rather difficult position to take.
Yeah. It's tricky, but there's no denying that that humans are a bit of a scourge. And if there were more pantheists in the world, there'd be more world peace and everyone would be happier.
Absolutely, yes. Good luck.
Because we're all peace-loving and nurturing kind of people.
Thanks, Robert.
I was wondering if there's anything at all like the 10 Commandments, any list of do's or don'ts.
Great question, David. No. Pantheists don't like that. We don't like to be dictated to. I think what you'll find, what guides us, and someone actually, I think, mentioned deep ecology, and that sits alongside pantheism quite nicely. And it's really sort of guided by, again, that idea of doing the least harm as possible to our environment and to other living beings. So that would be humans as well as other creatures, and paying deep respect to nature and how we live. So once you've got that as your basis, it actually does guide a lot about how you live your life. It is a work in progress. I think that most pantheists would all agree that we have our own struggles. So, I use too much plastic, and I'm well aware of the damage that that's doing. So I'm trying to reduce that, but it's my own little struggle. Yeah. So we're all on that journey, but that fundamentally is our 10 commandments, is that once you believe that you are only one small part of a very larger ecosystem that's much, much grander than what you are, but that your life depends on the health of nature and the environment, that's going to guide how you live on a daily basis and how you deal with other people around you and other living beings. Because if the community is unwell, if there are people that are living below the poverty line, if there are these types of things going on, then you can't possibly live much of a happy life, really. So once you've got that as your basis, that's how it guides you. And you find your own way and you do your best that you can do.
Thank you, David. It's John now and then Janet.
Now, thank you for opportunity. You've raised two issues that concern pantheism. One is the zoos that have animals in cages, and it looks like we will always have animals in cages because people will want to visit zoos with their children. But I'm just wondering if, in fact, there's an argument that, well, they're getting well fed, and if they're in the out in the open, in the open country, most of their day they're going around looking for things to hunt and to kill and to bring back to their young children if they've got young cubs or whatever. So I'm just wondering if you can argue that, well, eventually these animals will be happy to live in a cage, although when I was a kid and went to the zoo, I felt they were all in prison. It just seemed, really sad that they are just going up and down along the fence as if they are in prison. But I'm just wondering with your thought. And then the second thing, the population explosion was mentioned. Robert is very strong on this issue. I heard a talk on the ABC that the resources were in a balance with the world's population back in 1920. Since then, there have been too many people for the resources. Now we're 100 years later, so I've always felt that's quite a wise insight, and we shouldn't wonder, as Robert does, why we've got so much population here, and that may be the issue we should be addressing. So there's just 2 points that I'm making.
Yeah. So zoos can be done very badly and very appallingly, and traditionally they were done very badly and appallingly, and it was cruelty. I think that there are still many zoos like that, which is just appalling, and it breaks my heart when I think about some zoos that exist out there. When you've got a country with funding enough to provide appropriately for animals that are in captivity, then I think it is quite possible that animals can live quite happily, but some animals will be more easier for that to do than others, clearly, because of the nature of that animal. So whether they just have a very wide roaming area that we can't emulate, or whether there's other reasons. I mean, I myself remember polar bears in Auckland going mad because they were hot and they had a concrete enclosure. It was just awful. But so again, if zoos are done very well, and they are done, because now we've got animal behaviorists, we've got zoologists that understand what these animals need, it's done a lot better. But as always, there are examples which are appalling. So there are, if you do it well, then it's least amount of harm type thing. The population explosion, and yes, I don't like calling it the Western world, but those of us that are in wealthy nations, and even then there are people that live in wealthy nations that are living below the poverty line. So I'm talking about those that have the wealth in wealthy nations, consume far more than what we need, and we consume far more than the world can maintain, and so we will outstrip the resources that the earth has. But pantheists would argue that what drives us is not humanity's existence, but for the fact that we're destroying something pretty amazing. Like, there's nothing else that we know of in the universe quite like this. And so that in itself is reason why we should be changing our ways. Very complex issue, though, the human population issue.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Karyn. Now, Janet, would you like to say your question?
Hello. I'm thinking perhaps going back on another direction. Earlier, somebody asked about you might be able to explain what you are by saying what you're not. And I'm wondering if you could take that approach in explaining why you're the scientific side of pantheism and not the spiritual side. What's the difference?
Yeah, good question, Janet. So for me personally, I don't really sort of sense a spiritual essence in living beings. So I don't have a sense of a spiritual nature in a tree, in a squirrel or emu. I just see them as other sentient beings like myself. And I don't necessarily feel like there is something I can't put my finger on that exists that connects us in a spiritual sense, where some pantheists would that they would see a more of a spiritual side to life and living beings, and edge more towards something beyond what science can explain. Whereas for me, anything that science hasn't explained is because we can't yet, because we don't have our understanding wrapped around it. So I just sort of sit with a deep reverence for other living beings as much as my own, but not necessarily anything esoteric, spiritual, anything like that. They exist as atoms and cells, and when they die, those atoms and cells that came together to create that, it goes back into the soil and becomes something else. So I believe that some of my cells are dinosaurs, worse dinosaurs at some point, and many other things, because those matter gets recycled. So that's how I sit as a pantheist, scientific pantheist, which would probably differ to some other pantheists.
Thanks, Janice. Now, YJ, would you like to say your questions, or would you like me to read them out?
Please read.
Intrinsic meaning, in quotation marks, intrinsic meaning was mentioned earlier. Do pantheists mean in the context of humans as meaning-making creatures, or something metaphysical like the religious notion of, say, a soul?
I think what we mean is, actually, I don't know about intrinsic meaning, intrinsic worth. That's how I see other living beings and all of nature, as having intrinsic worth. And I would possibly use that with intrinsic meaning, like interchangeably, so that their worth and the meaning they have within this world is the same as what I have and any other human. So we all have our own intrinsic worth in this universe, in this ecosystem.
So the second question is, in cultures where ancestral veneration is highly valued, what's a pantheist attitude towards it?
Ancestral veneration, it depends what scope you mean with that. So when we venerate our ancestors, I think, again, if I was to tell you, it's probably going to be a Karyn view, not necessarily a pantheist view, because we're not all going to hold the same value of ancestry. And so that's a tricky one, because we don't necessarily have, again, like David questioned about the Ten Commandments or other documents that guide us in what we should be thinking and how we should be venerating certain parts of our life and past and so forth. So it actually comes probably down to us as individuals about how much we would place value on our ancestors and what they've handed down through the generations. I think most of us would sort of recognize the wisdom that gets handed down and trying to build on the wisdom that is passed down through the generations and how people lived prior to us. But beyond that, I think I would actually be talking as Karyn, not as a pantheist, because there is no one way of looking at that question, because pantheists, it doesn't ring fence you in the way that you would perceive that.
Thanks, YJ, for that second question, and thanks, Karyn. Now, Niambo, you have a question.
Basically, one thing that's always kind of intrigued me a bit about pantheism is mostly how do they kind of, basically conceive of God, in regards to basically being like the universe, like, are there, let's say, different branches of pantheism that conceive of God differently in that context?
Yeah, so we touched on that earlier, and I guess with scientific pantheists, most of us will tend to steer clear of using the word God, because it has a particular perception of what that is. And usually it's a supreme being that's all-knowing, all-seeing. It holds judgment. And scientific pantheists do not have that. We don't see that as existing. So when we talk about God as the universe, really it's saying that the universe is the only thing that exists worthy of deep reverence, because it is awe-inspiring, because it is all-encompassing, and we are just one small part of that very big vastness. That's how we view God, if you like.
Or maybe if there's one thing we could think of is that, another pantheistic way I thought of conceiving the universe is, the idea is basically that the universe is basically God, and that humans and, everything in the universe are just different parts of how God manifests. You
could say that. And if that's where, and in fact, it probably links back to what Janet was saying, that's moving into your more spiritual pantheism, as a likening a God as the universe. So
basically my idea is that basically I would like to kind of envision pretty much all creatures that are capable of at least human level, if not greater sentience. And even, creatures like chimpanzees are basically, like, you could say, the conscious and, cultural, and you could say, spiritual and, psychological manifestations of, God as the whole universe.
Yeah, I would, as a scientific pantheist, I would move away from that, because I am more of the view that each living being is part of the universe. We exist as individuals, as an ecosystem. We are connected by the way that we breathe air and we take in food or whatever, but not necessarily beyond that.
Thanks, Niambo. Okay, we'll go to YJ's third question, and to you, Karyn, and that is death and the pantheist. Your thoughts on it?
And I think I just touched on it very briefly just then. So a scientific pantheist will generally believe that on death, all the cells that created who we were go back into the earth. Depending on, if you're cremated, then the ashes go back into the earth. So the cells that create us are just simply returned back into nature and are dispersed and become other things. So that's, and I think for a lot of people that sounds fairly brutal, but most pantheists sit quite comfortably in that, and know that we become compost to create further life. And that's fine with us, being part of the cycle of life.
Thanks, YJ. Thanks, Karyn. Okay, we'll go to Dirk.
Thanks. What I'd like to come back to is the use of theism in the word pantheism. The way that you've explained it from a scientific pantheistic point of view, there is very little of the theism left.
Yeah, and that's because pantheism as a word was created in 1705, which was still very much embedded in the sense of God being nature and nature being God. So scientific pantheism is a more modern title for moving away from the interlink with God. So you can be a pantheist, and actually Nambo is talking about that as, like God being everything and everything being God, and that still exists as a pantheist, but a scientific pantheist has moved away from that. So we still have the word pantheism, and it's interesting because it could have been called anything, but that's what John, whatever his name is, in 1705 called it, and so that's what we have. And it's interesting because I think Les asked me when we first had the chat before I came here about that, and I said I don't tend to think about it. We could have been called squirrels, and I would be fine with that title, because it's not so much what's in that word, it's really what the underpinning beliefs are. So the underpinning beliefs aligned with what I believed, and it just happened to have the title pantheist. So I was like, okay, so that's what I am. But I haven't put too much stock in what that word actually means and how it's broken down, because I just know that it just summarizes, it gives a label to summarize my perspective on life.
Okay. Thank you, Karyn, for being so giving and open. And I think you've given us a real insight with the contrast and compare bits. How do we contrast pantheism with even other versions of pantheism and other worldviews, and ways in which it's similar to other worldviews as well? I think you've done a really terrific job, and I think you've given us all a real insight into that. And you've been, as I said, very open and honest with your answers tonight. So all of us appreciate that. So a big thanks to you.
I think it's been a lovely opportunity. So thank you very much. It's been fascinating.
You can download a recording of today's Ex-Religious Support Network session from the Rational Realm website. You can also download the other sessions in this series. Just go to rationalrealm.com, and in the top menu bar, click on Philosophy, Resources. I look forward to seeing you at our next Ask Me Any Question session.